Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Gollier, and I will moderate this 16th webinar of CEPR and the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economics on climate policy. So the point today we want to address is about mostly the evaluation of the social cost of carbon. If I take the US, the social cost of carbon has been until recently, I mean until end of last year, fixed to around $60 per ton of CO2. It moved to $200 per ton of CO2 in December 2023 by a decision of the Environmental Protection Agency. And now we have this important paper that has been published by NBR and CEPR over the next few months. The title is The Macroeconomic Impacts of Climate Change, Global versus Local Temperature. And this paper is suggesting that we way underestimated this social cost of carbon. So I decided to invite, to propose to invite the two authors of that paper, Adrien Bilal from Harvard and Diego Känzig from Northwestern to present this paper. So they accepted my invitation. And so they will have 55 minutes for presenting the paper. Then I also asked Simon Dietz, who is from LSE, to discuss that paper. And I allocate to him 20 minutes for his discussion. So that will leave us with 15 minutes for discussion. This discussion will be live, so I will allow you to open your mic, in fact, to raise your hand, and Elise will switch on your mic for allowing us to present your question to the authors and the discussant. So without any further introduction, let me give the floor to Adrien Bilal, who will make the presentation. But Diego is not far if needed for contributing to the presentation. So Adrien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the introduction. Let me get started. So as Christian said, the title of the paper is The Macro Impact of Climate Change, Global versus Local Temperature. It's joint work with Diego Känzig from Northwestern, who's here with us today. All right, so the starting point of this paper is that you can often hear that climate change is an existential threat. You can hear it if you talk to some of your friends. You can hear it if you read the press. More importantly, you can hear it if you listen to what climate scientists have been saying for decades, namely that the scale of the transformations that climate change will bring about is so large that it's going to profoundly affect our lives and livelihoods. However, if you look at the economic impact of climate change, you see a really different story. There's a huge literature estimating the cost of temperature for economic activity. And the vast majority of those papers find pretty small effects, actually. They typically found that a 1 degree increase in temperature implies a 1, 2, or 3% decline in GDP. So if you combine that with background economic growth and any plausible discounting, if we live in a 3-degree world by the end of the century, that actually doesn't sound catastrophic at all. However, all of these estimates rely on within country local temperature. So they always look at the effect of a country's given temperature on economic activity. And so the questions we want to answer we're going to ask in this paper is first, is it the case that the cost of climate change is actually that small? Or perhaps is it the case that local temperature provides an incomplete representation of what climate change will do to the economy? And so we propose answers in this paper in 3 parts. In the first part of the paper, we provide a new macroeconomic estimate of the impact of temperature on economic activity. Our main argument is to shift attention away from local country-level temperature and towards global mean temperature. And that's in line with ideas from geoscience, namely that global temperature is a better summary of what's going on in the climate than specifically local temperatures. Fortunately, there's plenty of variation to go around in global mean temperatures, and so we're going to exploit variation coming from things like solar cycles and El Nino events, and so we're going to rely on a time series specification. Our headline result is that a 1 degree increase in global temperature implies a 12% decline in world GDP at peak. That's about 6 to 7 times larger than what we find when we use the same data, the same empirical specification, but looking instead at the effect of local temperature, which is then about 1.5% per degree Celsius. Now, this is a large number, and so in the presentation, we're going to go through a number of robustness exercises that hopefully will convince you that many of the concerns that I'm sure you're already thinking about are not that big concerns, and that we're actually capturing the causal effect of temperature on economic activity. In the second part of the paper, we then ask, well, why is it the case then that global temperature has so much larger effects on economic activity than local temperature? And we provide one explanation, which is that actually, if you look at the data after we've collected a worldwide data set on extreme events based on physical measures of weather, we find that global temperature is much more strongly related to extreme events that we know are damaging. And so namely, we find a strong association between global temperature, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and extreme wind, whereas we don't find much of a correlation when we look at local temperature instead. In the third part of the paper, we then use our reduced form estimates to get at the welfare cost of climate change. So what we do is we write down the simplest possible model we can think of to answer that question, which is the neoclassical growth model, which is basically the economic block of the Dietz model in Nordhaus. But crucially, we use our reduced form estimates to estimate the structural damage functions in that environment. And so if we target our local temperature estimates, we get a social cost of carbon of about $200 per ton, and that's very much in line with the existing estimates and the literature. However, if we target our global temperature estimates instead, we find that the social cost of carbon is above $1,000 per ton, and that's even with a pretty conservative climate sensitivity. Another way to look at those results is to ask, well, what would happen if global temperatures were to increase by another 2 degrees Celsius above today's temperature? So let's say about 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial by the end of the century. And so what we found that has a pronounced effect on consumption and output. And by the end of the century, output is about 50% below a baseline. And so if you take the relevant time average of these effects, you get at a 29% present welfare loss today because of future climate change. So to put these numbers into context, that's about the same size as the 1929 Great Depression in the United States. But the Great Depression lasted a couple of years, and because climate change is permanent, this 29% welfare loss is going to be there forever. Now, that's not a very upbeat picture. There is perhaps one silver lining to these results, which is that once you have a large social cost of carbon, say in excess of $1,000 per ton, it means that for large economies like the US or the European Union, paying for decarbonization actually then becomes cost effective, even if these economies act in their own self-interest and act unilaterally. Okay, and we'll get back to that at the end of the talk. Let me just mention one thing in terms of the related literature. So as I've already alluded to, there's a huge literature estimating the impacts of temperature on economic activity. I don't have time to do justice to it, unfortunately, in this presentation. But let me just flag that virtually all of it looks at the effect of local temperature on GDP. And our main focus in this paper instead is to shift away from local temperature towards global temperature as our main independent variable, and then combine these reduced form estimates with the structural model to get at the social cost of carbon and welfare. All right, so now let me jump right into the meat of the paper. So we're interested in estimating the effect of global temperature on economic activity, which we're going to take to be world GDP. So these two panels here plot the time series of global temperature and world GDP starting in the mid-50s. So you can see that global temperature is initially relatively stable, and that was actually back in the days mostly due to aerosol emissions that were offsetting the warming effect of carbon. And then once we got aerosol emissions under control, you see temperature starting to rise again pretty gradually until today. On the right panel, you also see world GDP, and of course you see continued economic growth with some fluctuations around the trend. And so, of course, if we were just to use these unconditional series to try to get at the effect of temperature on GDP, we would get a positive number. And that's precisely because when GDP goes up, emissions goes up, emissions go up, emissions go up, meaning the planet warms. And so we would get a spurious positive correlation, which is actually coming from the greenhouse effect, which would not be capturing the damages associated with global temperature. Okay, and so that's why we have to essentially remove the trend in temperature and GDP and identify the effects of temperature on GDP off of deviations from these trends. And as you can already see, there's a lot of fluctuations in temperature around its trend. And so we're going to construct what we're going to call temperature shocks. Specifically, we're going to leverage the approach by Hamilton 2018, which is at its heart very simple. We're going to construct forecast errors or innovations to the temperature process relative to a trend that we estimate based off of, past realizations of temperature. So basically what we do is project temperature at some horizon on past values of temperature. So, yesterday up to P lags, and then we extract the temperature shock as the innovation to that regression. Okay, so then you may ask, well, why is it even the case that there is variation in temperature around the trend? Well, geoscience tells us that there are many reasons why temperatures fluctuate around the slow-moving trend. So there are external causes such as solar cycles. Every 10 years, 11 years, about 11 years, the north and south pole of the sun flip, and then that changes surface activity on the sun and changes the amount of radiation that the Earth gets, and so that leads to fluctuations in temperature. Volcanic eruptions are also other reasons why temperatures may be a bit lower in 1 or 2 years after the eruption. So that's for the examples of external causes. There are others, and then there are internal causes, such as the El Nino cycle, which varies fairly unpredictably between 2 and 7 years. Okay, so we want to capture these types of events that drive temperature fluctuations around the trend. And so we have to choose a horizon at which to construct our innovation or forecast error. And so in our baseline, we're going to use a horizon of 2 years so that we can capture somewhat persistent shocks to global temperature. And then we're also going to use 2 lags. I'm going to show you robustness exercises where we use 1 step ahead forecast errors, add more lags. None of that actually matters for our estimates, but this is going to be our baseline specification. All right. So now let me show you our temperature shocks. This is what they look like. So you can see these fluctuations of global temperature around, relative to the trend now. And so you can see that they're, mean 0. They seem somewhat autocorrelated, but not super strongly autocorrelated. And importantly, their magnitude is about 0.1, 0.2 degrees C. Okay, so they're not huge, but they're also not tiny. So that's what we're going to use for identification. And then what we're interested in is getting at the causal effect of these temperature shocks on GDP. And so we're going to use a local projection specification in the time series context where we project changes in GDP relative to T-1, H periods ahead in the future. So we're fixing the T-1, and then we look at the effect at all possible horizons of this temperature shock at time T, conditional on a bunch of controls that we're going to discuss in a little while. Okay. So, as long as you include enough lags of temperature and GDP in this specification and use a 1 step ahead forecast error, that's actually it's numerically identical to the standard local projection specification without the detrending first. We've shown it with the detrending just to clarify a little bit where our identifying variation actually comes from. All right, so before I discuss the controls, let me just show you our plain vanilla results, okay? Our baseline results. Okay, so this graph shows you, the impact of a temperature shock at time 0, normalized to be of size 1 degree Celsius on GDP at all subsequent horizons. What you can see is that on impact, GDP goes down by about 2%. And then over time, this effect gradually declines to eventually reach a 12% reduction in GDP 6 years out, and then eventually a mean reverse. Okay, so that's a pretty substantial effect. But of course, as you can see, there are some standard errors around them that are not tiny, and that just simply reflects the time series nature of our variation that starts in the 1960s. The other thing I want to highlight here is that the underlying temperature shock itself is not fully transitory. In fact, if you look at the temperature shock itself here on the right-hand side, it actually has a fair bit of internal persistence. And that's in part because we've selected this two-step ahead specification, but you also get it with a one-step ahead specification. And so the 12% decline in GDP is itself the product of cumulating effects of past temperature shocks that are persistent. And so you get a 12% reduction in GDP today, not only because of this 1 Celsius increase in global temperature on impact, but also because 3 years out, temperature remains persistently elevated by about 0.3 degrees C at that point. And that also has an effect on GDP 6 years out. So that may explain where we get large numbers. And we also, you get the same actually pattern for local temperature, and I'm going to show you that later. And of course, we're going to take that into account when we construct the social cost of carbon and our temperature counterfactors. Okay. All right. So now I'm sure most of you, if you could ask questions now, you would. And I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have many pressing concerns with these numbers, and hopefully I'll address them in the next couple slides. Okay, so there are several threats to the causal interpretation of these results. The first one that jumps to mind is that, well, it's a time series specification, so perhaps we just got unlucky, and these temperature shocks happen to hit at the same time as there's an unrelated economic shock. So if it gets really hot during the Great Recession, then we would be mistakenly attributing the decline in GDP to a temperature shock, but it's actually just caused by an unrelated economic shock. So actually, in our vector of controls that I've shown you in the specification, we're already controlling, in the numbers I've just shown you, we're already controlling for a rich set of macro financial variables. So we have dummy indicators for the major recession dates, the old shocks in the 70s. We also include the 90s recession and the Great Recession in 2009. We include lags of GDP to also help alleviate some of the concerns associated with persistence in these recessions. And then in our most restrictive specification, which I'll show you later, we also have the treasury rate, and other macro financial variables, and actually controlling for those macro, these recessions and the macro financial variables actually does not affect our estimates at all, which suggests that these temperature shocks are largely uncorrelated with underlying economic shocks. We also have a jackknife exercise where we evaluate the contribution of every year to our main estimate. And actually, you can see that, of course, if you change the sample, the estimate changes a little bit, but it's actually, our main estimate is largely independent of the years that we decide to censor, okay? And then in the panel specification, which we're going to go next, we'll show you much more flexible controls at the country and regional levels that also seem to be irrelevant for our main estimate. Okay. The second threat to identification that comes to mind in this time series context is reverse causality. Well, perhaps it is the case. Maybe there's a temperature shock and that causes GDP to decline, but this decline in GDP lowers emissions. If emissions go down, temperatures going forward also go down. And so that affects our GDP estimate. However, qualitatively, in the logic that I've just described, this reverse causality should lead us to underestimate the true effects because temperatures going forward are actually lower than they should be. Now, we can check whether reverse causality, and qualitatively, we're going to get an underestimate. Quantitatively, there are reasons to believe that it's actually going to be very small. Why? Well, in particular, because the year-to-year fluctuations in GDP imply year-to-year fluctuations in emissions that are actually fairly small compared to the accumulated stock of carbon over the last 200 years. And so temperature is just not going to react that much to these changes in emissions. So we can test that in two ways. The first one is to try to forecast temperature shocks with past macro variables. And so that's a Granger causality test. And we actually cannot credibly forecast temperature with past macro variables, which is already telling us that there's just not much action there. What we can also do is actually explicitly adjust our estimates for reverse causality. So we use a climate model that tells us how a given change in emissions affects temperatures going forward based on CO2 emissions, so that carbon dioxide, methane, as well as aerosols, so sulfur dioxide emissions. And then we can include that in what, if you will, is a bivariate VAR and adjust our main estimate based on these leading climate models. And we can see in this figure is that actually that just doesn't seem to make any meaningful difference. If you adjust for carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide, you basically get back the exact same estimate as we had in our baseline. And that's, again, following this logic that these year-to-year fluctuations in emissions are just not important enough to make a dent in our main estimates. Okay, so far, hopefully, I've convinced you that at least in the time series context, there are not major reasons to be worried about threats to identification. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to a panel context where we're going to disaggregate world GDP at the country level. And there we can do many things. We can control more flexibly for omitted variable bias and show you more exercises to keep convincing you, hopefully, that these results are causal. And then, importantly, we can compare the effect of global temperature with the effect of local temperature. Okay, so in this context, we're going to use a panel data set that covers 173 countries that starts in 1960s. And for a subsample of these countries, using the Jorda Sholaric-Taylor macro history database, we'll be able to go back in time to 1900, okay? We're going to get standard economic variables from the Penn World Tables, and then we combine that with temperature data from NOAA and Berkeley Earth, which was already the temperature data you've seen. And then for the second part of the paper, we also combine these data with a new data set on extreme events that we've constructed, pulling data from the intersectoral intermodal intercomparison project, EAERE, that gives us gridded data at the daily level on temperature, wind speed, and precipitation that we use to construct country-level measures of these extremes. Okay, so now the specification that we use is going to be very similar to the one you've seen in the time series with two differences. The first one is we put country-level GDP on the left-hand side, so we're going to be in a panel. We're going to include country fixed effects and country-specific controls, but our shock of interest is still going to be the global temperature shock, okay? So importantly, we don't have any time fixed effects here because it would soak up our variation of interest, but we still have our macro financial controls. Now, in this specification, we can estimate the impact of global temperature shocks with this specification. And if we replace the temperature shock with local temperature, we're going to get the effect of local temperatures. So let me first show you that in this panel specification, the impact of global temperature on average country level GDP is pretty much the same as for world GDP, okay, directly. So the black line is the average effect in the panel. The dashed red line is the aggregate effect from the time series. And you can see that these two things are virtually identical. So that's just a sanity check before we proceed, just to make sure that in the panel and in the time series, we get similar estimates of global temperature on economic activity. That's already telling us that these country fixed effects are not going to play much of a role in our controls. All right. So now that we're in the panel setting, we can do a lot more. Okay. So I'm going to show you, just for consistency, to all of these robustness checks in the panel. So the first thing we do is to check whether changes in our construction of the temperature shock matter for our results, and the short answer is they don't. So our baseline is the dashed red line, the Hamilton with a 2-step ahead forecast error. If we do a 1-step ahead forecast error, we get exactly the same thing. If we do one-sided HP filtering to remove the trend, we get again the same thing. And if we use another variant of the Hamilton filter, we even get slightly a larger effect. Okay. So again, it doesn't matter how no matter how we construct the temperature shock, we get consistent estimates. Oops, I'm not sure what happened here. Why this is so much larger. Okay, excellent. The second thing we can do is then make sure that our estimates are likely to be externally valid. And so there are two things that we'd like to check to make sure that our estimates are not too specific to our sample. The first thing is to make sure that our estimates are robust to changing the underlying source of variation that's driving global temperature. Okay, so what we're doing here is controlling for El Nino events and controlling for volcanic eruptions, and then relying mostly on variation coming from, say, solar cycles and other sources of climate variation, okay? And what you can see here is that you can control for El Nino, you can control for volcanic eruptions. It, again, doesn't change the main estimates of the impact of global temperature on economic activity. And so that's reassuring because it tells us that it doesn't seem to matter really what's the underlying source of the temperature variation. What really matters is whether global temperature goes up or not. The other thing exercise that we can do to check external validity is to look at our main estimates in different samples, okay, different time windows. So the first thing we do is look at the substantially shortened sample that starts after the oil shocks of the 70s, so that starts in 1985, and we compare the estimate in the short sample in black with the baseline in dashed red, and in fact, you see that the estimate is really similar. If anything, it's actually a bit larger in the most recent sample, which is telling us that there doesn't seem to be a ton of adaptation to global temperature shocks going on, at least historically. And then using the macro history database, we could go back much further in time and start our analysis in 1900. So we have 120 years of data there. And again, there you can see, now keep in mind that this is a different set of countries now, but you can again see that the estimate in the long sample is very similar to our baseline estimate, which is again reassuring. All right, you can and then you can worry whether our results are driven by pre-trends, perhaps, and we check that directly here in this specification, where we estimate also the effect of global temperature on past GDP, and you can see that we estimate relatively precisely estimated 0, which is the same thing as saying that our Granger causality test earlier were not detecting any forecastability of temperature by past microvariables. Okay, the last thing I'd like to, oops, sorry, let me go back. Okay. All right, now the last thing that we have to look at is whether these changes in global temperature, look similar to changes in local temperature in terms of their impact on GDP. Okay, so now hopefully that I've convinced you that the impact of global temperature seems to be robust to a whole host of exercises that we can devise. Now the question is, how does it compare to the impact of local temperature? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a specification where we simply replace the global temperature shock on the right-hand side with the local temperature shock. Okay, now, and that's exactly the same specification, exactly the same data. Now, of course, here we don't have a time-fixed effect because we wanted to use the same specification as for global temperature. We could also throw in a time-fixed effect, and so we're going to show you local temperature specifications with and without the time-fixed effect, and then compare that to our global temperature specification. Okay, so we're going to construct our temperature shocks with the same Hamilton filter as we've used for a global temperature. And so what you can see here for two specific countries, the US and South Africa, you can see that the local temperature shock is a little bit more volatile than global temperature shocks in blue, but not dramatically more volatile. Okay, so the standard deviation of these global temperature shocks is around 0.1, 0.2 degrees C. For local temperatures, about 0.5 degrees C. So in both cases, we're leveraging temperature shocks that are relatively smaller than the changes in global temperature that we're ultimately interested in. Okay. Now, the other thing is that these local temperature shocks are not very correlated with global temperature shocks. You often see them moving in opposite direction. The correlation is 0.3, so it's not tiny, but it's also not giant. Okay, and so then if we look at the impact of these local temperature shocks on GDP in the same data with the same specification as for global temperature, this is what we get. Okay, so what you can see is that local temperature have an impact on GDP of about 1.5% per degree Celsius at peak, which is at about 5 years out here. And it really doesn't matter whether you include or exclude the time-fixed effect. You get a very similar response. These are the two red lines. Okay, so that's already telling us that the effect of temperature on GDP is really about the nature of the shock rather than about the set of controls that you include. And that's already something that was suggested by our previous analysis for global temperature. But really, if you look at this figure, the main message that you get is that the impact of local temperature on GDP is much smaller than the impact of global temperature, which here in the panel stands at about 11% and is about 5 to 6 times larger than the impact on local temperature. Okay, and so now the natural question, of course, is, well, what explains this large difference between the impact of local temperature and the impact of global temperature. And so our conjecture in this paper is that global temperature is a better summary of what's going on in the climate. And so when global temperature goes up, temperature goes up on land, but also the oceans are warming. And when the oceans warm, that can change evaporation patterns, it can change wind patterns in much more profound ways than when, it's a little bit hotter in France than it is in Germany in one particular year. Okay. And so what we're going to check is whether these changes in global temperature are correlated with extreme events in a different way than local temperature. And so we're going to use our ISMIP data to do that. Okay. And so this is what we find. On the left, the top left panel starts, just as a warmer, shows you the correlation between a global temperature shock and then local temperature. And then that's the black line, and then shows you the correlation between a local temperature shock and local temperature. What you can see is that in both cases, there's a very similar degree of mean reversion. And so for average temperature, it seems that the two shocks have relatively similar effects. What you can see in the other three panels, however, is that for extremes, they have really different correlations with extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and extreme wind. So the top right panel shows you that when global temperature goes up by 1 degree C, the frequency of extreme heat doubles. We've constructed these extreme heat indices at the country level so that they have a baseline 5% probability of occurring. And so what you can see here is that the probability more than doubles on impact and then stays persistently elevated at 5 percentage points above baseline. So that's more than doubling the baseline. That's doubling the baseline probability. Whereas for local temperature, you do see an increase in the frequency of heat waves, but nowhere near as large as when global temperature goes up. And the difference is even more stark if you look at extreme precipitation and extreme wind. In those cases, you see a dramatic increase after you have a global temperature shock, but you barely see any change when you have a local temperature shock. And so for extreme precipitation and extreme wind, these represent more like a 20 to 50% increase in the baseline probability for a global temperature. Okay, so it really seems like the nature of the shock is completely different when you look at global versus a local temperature. Something that's not in the presentation and not in the paper yet, but we're going to include is an analysis that looks at a possibly different explanation for these effects, which is to look at economic spillovers through trade and commodity prices. And in our analysis so far, we actually don't find much evidence that that's a driving factor behind those estimates. And so that's why we actually emphasize these differences in extreme events. The other thing I'll mention is that you can also try to do, it's not in the paper, not in the slides yet, but you can try to do a decomposition where you try to break up, the impact of extreme events on GDP and then the impact of temperature on these extreme events. And if you look at just these three, you get about 60% of the way there. So they don't explain everything, but they explain a sizable fraction of our global temperature estimates. And therefore, perhaps if you added more measures of extremes, including droughts, etc., perhaps you could get all the way. So again, that to us suggests that these extreme events are a plausible explanation for why global temperature has such larger effects on GDP than local temperature. Okay, in the paper, we then also asked, once we've established the effect of global temperature on GDP, what margins of GDP respond? And so we find that the capital stock and investment both fall, and labor productivity also falls. Okay, so I'm just going to flash these results. You can see that the global temperature shock, persistently depresses investment, leads to a prolonged fall in the capital stock, and depresses total factor productivity as estimated in Penworth tables, as well as labor productivity. Okay, so that's actually going to be consistent with the damage functions we're going to back out down the road. Okay, so these results seem to be consistent with both productivity damages as is traditionally used in this literature, but also with some capital depreciation damages. Okay, so far we've looked at the effect of global temperature on world GDP or average GDP across all countries. And of course, you may wonder whether these effects are uniform across space, across countries, or whether they're highly heterogeneous. And we know that for local temperature, the effects are fairly heterogeneous and depend on your baseline temperature. And so we look at that in the paper, and we do find some heterogeneity by baseline temperature, but it's not as stark as for local temperature. I think the best way to see those results is to look at the impact of global temperature for different regions of the world. So it simply split our analysis for different regions. And what we find is that actually global temperature has fairly uniformly detrimental effects across all regions of the world except Central and East Asia. And so in very hot regions of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, you do see that the effects are larger than the world average and can go all the way up to 20%, a 20% loss in GDP. But even for cooler regions like Europe, there you see a fairly pronounced effect that peaks at 7-8%. And for North America, actually, that's pretty representative of the world average. So why does it go up? Why does GDP go up in Central and East Asia? We conjecture that that's driven by the relatively large number of cold countries in that region. Now, I want to emphasize that comparison across regions or across groups of countries are very noisy because once you rely on time series variation, there's only so much we can do. And so any comparison across temperature or income groups or these regions should be interpreted with a grain of salt. Okay, so now that we've established that global temperature has a large effect on the world GDP, we're going to use those reduced form estimates to then discipline a structural model of climate change so that we can think about the social cost of carbon and welfare. So we're going to use the neoclassical growth model. So if you've taken an intro macro class, you're going to be extremely familiar with pretty much everything that's in this model. Okay, so we're going to model households as solving a consumption smoothing problem. It's set in continuous time. So households are going to maximize the discounted flow of future utility, U of C, from consumption using a rate of time preference rho. They do so subject to a completely standard budget constraint where they allocate their wage and their interest from capital to consumption and investment. Right? Super standard problem. Firms maximize flow profits subject to a Cobb-Douglas production function. They pay for capital, renting capital from households, and they pay for depreciation, and then they pay for labor. Prices clear capital and labor markets. So the only deviation from the standard neoclassical growth model here is how productivity and the capital depreciation rate are determined. So these are time varying objects that are perfectly foreseen by households. So it's a perfect foresight exercise. And they're going to be a function of past temperature shocks. Okay, so we're going to specify productivity to be a weighted average of past temperature shocks, where the weights are given by this zeta S function, which tells you what a temperature shock S periods ago does to productivity today. And then we have a similar specification for capital depreciation. So this zeta S and this delta S are the structural damage functions that we estimate. And so when they're delta functions at 0, then temperature only has an instantaneous impact. But when they're smooth functions, it means that temperature has a delayed effect on GDP. And that's pretty important in our case because remember, we had these pretty delayed effects of temperature on GDP and capital. And so we want to capture them. Okay, so now we want to use our reduced form GDP and capital impulse response functions to identify the damage functions. So in the model, we can obtain a very simple identification results. So for estimation only, and only for estimation, we're going to use log linearization. Remember, the temperature shocks were fairly small, 0.1 degrees C, so they imply GDP fluctuations of the order of 1%. So that means that we can use a log linearization to estimate the underlying shocks. Of course, for counterfactuals, we're going to use global solution methods because then we're going to look at large changes in temperature. And so from just log linearizing the production function, you get that the deviation in GDP is equal to the deviation in productivity plus alpha capital share times the deviation in capital. Okay, so if we measure the GDP response and the capital response, and we do, we can just take the difference between the two and back out the underlying productivity. Okay, so that's kind of a ridiculously simple version of a production function estimation. Okay, now to estimate capital depreciation shock, things are a little richer because we have to take into account the full dynamics of the model. Now, fortunately, if you log linearize the model, you can map one-to-one a sequence of capital depreciation shocks into a sequence of observed capital responses with this Jacobian here in the middle that we can solve in closed form inside the model. And so that means that if we take an observed global temperature shock in the data, we trace out its effect on GDP and capital, that's going to give us the Y hat and the K hat. From that, we can immediately construct a sequence of productivity shocks and capital depreciation shocks. And then we're going to get the structural damage functions zeta and delta as innovations to this implied productivity and capital depreciation sequence, okay? And of course, along the way, we account for the internal persistence of the temperature shock to itself, as I've shown you in the data. Okay, so that's what we get. So panel A shows you, so this is 2 times the same panel, shows you the underlying path of global temperature. Okay, so that you've already seen. I've shown you that before. Panel B shows you the output response and the capital response to this temperature shock. The dashed line is the data, and the solid line is the model fit. Now, here we could match the implied responses one for one, but for reasons that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, we constrain a little bit the functional form of these damage functions to ensure that they go back to 0. So we're being conservative, and that also helps us inform long-run effects from these short-run, I should say medium-run responses, okay? So you can see that, we have 3 parameters for the productivity and the capital depreciation responses. We're trying to match 11 points, so the fit is not too bad. Okay, so that's for output, and that's for capital. And so panel C shows you the implied damage functions that come from matching this output and capital response with an underlying temperature path that looks just like in the data. And so this is what you get. Now, of course, the productivity response now is much smaller than the output response for 2 reasons. A, we've netted out the capital response in our target, and B, we've accounted for the internal persistence of temperature itself. Now, if you take this productivity path and interacted with the temperature process, you would get something that would go to about 10% productivity loss because of the cumulated effect of past temperature shocks on GDP would be pretty close to what we have when we look at TFP and labor productivity directly. So that's also reassuring. Okay, so the productivity effect peaks at 3%. And so that corresponds to now a fully transitory temperature shock inside the model. Okay, so it peaks at 3% and then mean reverts 10 years out. The capital depreciation response is shorter lived, but it's fairly large. You get a 1 percentage point capital depreciation shock on impact, and then you go back to 0. The shaded errors are the bootstrapped standard errors around our estimates. And so again, you can see that they were not small in the data, so they're also not particularly small around our front estimates. Okay. So just to summarize, within the model, to a fully transitory global temperature shock of 1 degree C, we get a 3% productivity loss at peak and a 1 percentage point capital depreciation loss at peak. And the effects on productivity are somewhat persistent, despite the underlying shock now being fully transitory. And then we can repeat the estimation with local temperature shocks instead. So instead of targeting our global temperature estimates, we target our local temperature estimates. And in that case, of course, the target is much smaller, and so the implied productivity shocks are also much, and capital depreciation shocks are also much smaller. And so here, I've put the same scale by design, so it becomes a little hard to read, but productivity goes down by about 0.5% at peak following a local temperature shock relative to a global temperature shock. And for capital depreciation, it's about 0.5 percentage point. Okay, so the effects of local temperature shocks on GDP or on productivity and capital depreciation are much smaller than for global temperature. And that's simply because we use a different empirical target and that the local temperature target was much smaller than the global temperature target. Okay, and so now that we've estimated our structural damage functions, we are in a position to evaluate the welfare cost of climate change as well as the social cost of carbon. Now, if we want to look at climate change in this environment, it's very simple. So here, remember, we haven't introduced an emissions block that connects GDP to temperature. And so if we want to look at a climate change counterfactual, we just have to specify the path of excess temperature. Okay, so we're going to use 2024 as a baseline. And then we gradually add 2 degrees C by 2100. And so that's going to correspond to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. Okay, so it's a somewhat conservative business as usual scenario. The definition of business as usual keeps changing. So it's adding 3 degrees C above pre-industrial by the end of the century. Okay, so that's for our climate change scenario. When we construct the social cost of carbon, there we have to take a stance on the link between emissions and a temperature. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to take the path of excess temperatures that is associated with emitting just 1 ton of carbon. And we're going to take that from the leading climate models that are described and analyzed in Simon's very nice work. Okay, so we're going to take from the climate modeling literature, if you emit a pulse of carbon today, how do temperatures change going forward? So it's about 0.0002 degrees C per ton of carbon. I think I've got the number of 0 right, but you can correct me if I'm wrong in the Q&A. And then we feed in that temperature path, and then we look at the welfare effect, the one-time dollar value of all of the future losses associated with that warming path, and that's the social cost of carbon. Okay, we're going to use a fairly conservative climate sensitivity here, which is lower than the median in Simon's work, because we want to be as conservative as we're trying to be as conservative as possible, and showing that despite conservative choices, global temperature implies a much larger effect than local temperature, and it's also a bit more consistent with the link between historical temperatures and emissions. And I'll show you what happens at the end if you use the median climate sensitivity from Simon's work. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the welfare impact of climate change. So this is our main counterfactual. Okay, so panel A shows you the gradual increase in temperature that we feed in. So it reaches 2 degrees C above today by 2100, and then plateaus off at 2.3 degrees C in the long run. And then we're going to feed in the same temperature path under our global shock estimation and under our local shock estimation. So panel B shows you the predicted path of output relative to baseline. Okay, so the baseline, you could imagine feeding in CFP growth and have a growing economy, or just staying at steady state. We're showing here everything relative to that baseline. So output, if you target local temperature estimates, so the traditional estimates, that's the dashed red line, output gradually declines and reaches about -7% by the end of the century. Okay, so that's a moderate effect that's in line with a lot of the previous work that's out there. If you target global temperature shocks instead, the global responses to global temperature shocks instead, that's the solid blue line. And there you can see that you get a much larger output decline by the end of the century that is about 47%, so nearly a half a reduction of GDP by the end of the century, and that's cuts GDP in half. Panel C shows you a decline in capital, which is also pronounced, and then panel D shows you the decline in consumption that largely tracks the decline in output. It also reaches about -50% by the end of the century. Okay, so in both, the shaded areas show you the bootstrap standard areas. Again, in both cases for local temperature and global temperature, they're actually not small, but we can still distinguish the effects from one another. And then the welfare impact is the appropriately discounted, present discounted value of the path of consumption. And so, of course, it jumps upon impact because in terms of welfare, households take into account future consumption losses. And so this is our about 30% welfare loss upon impact when households wake up and realize that climate change is going to happen. And then, of course, it gradually declines up to the point where discounting doesn't matter anymore because we've reached a new steady state with a constant consumption decline. And there it plateaus around 48% welfare losses. Okay, so if you compare that to what you get with under local temperature, there the welfare loss on impact is 4%. Okay, so that's much, much lower than the 29% welfare loss that you get under global temperature estimates. All right. And then the last panel shows you the social cost of carbon in 2024. Okay, so under local temperature shocks, it's about $200 per ton, again, in line with what the EPA is saying and recent work on the social cost of carbon. Simon has a really nice review meta-analysis of all the social costs of carbon out there, and this $200 per ton value kind of falls squarely within the traditional range. If you use global temperature to calibrate the model instead, you get something that's substantially larger, that's above $1,000 per ton. Okay. Another exercise that we can do, I think I have time to show you that, is instead of looking forward in time, is looking back in time. Okay, so these numbers are a little different than those that we have in the paper, and so these are the updated numbers that you should put your faith in. Okay, so what we can look at is, historically, how much did global temperature contribute to economic growth in the world? So panel A shows you the world growth rate of output with climate change in blue, so that's the realization in the data, and without climate change once we adjust for the damages associated with climate change. And what's really interesting here is that you can barely see any difference, right? In the first part of the sample, they track each other very closely. And then even in the late part of the sample where warming really picks up, you kind of have to look hard to see the difference visually. However, by the end of the century, so that's telling us that, the effects of global temperature on economic activity, because global temperature shocks are, not very large, they're largely hidden behind background economic variability. But because climate change is so persistent, by the early 2000s, you lose about a third of baseline economic growth to accelerating a warming. Okay, so that's what panel B shows you. That's a fraction of your average growth rate of the economy that's lost to climate change. So on average, since the 60s, it's 10%, but it's accelerating, and so in the 2000s, it's closer to 30%. And so if you accumulate all of these growth effects, you get in panel C, you get that the world output today relative to 1960 is about 18% lower today than without climate change, because these growth effects eventually accumulate. The other interesting thing is that even if warming stopped today, we've locked in another 8% of GDP losses because of these delayed effects of temperature on GDP. So it would go all the way up to 25%, even if warming stopped today. Again, welfare is obviously lower if you account for future warming as well. Okay, so these are again large numbers, and so now I want to hopefully convince you that they're not driven by specific choices that we've made in our structural estimation. So panel A and B shows you how the welfare effects and the social cost of carbon change if we change the baseline rate of time preference. Okay, so the preference for time in the household problem. So here we've used 2% as our baseline. That's consistent with the risk-free interest rate of 2% prior to climate change. And what you can see is that, of course, if you make households discount more the future, the welfare losses are smaller. But even at relatively high rates of time preference, welfare losses still exceed 20%. And are, of course, and the relative between global and local temperature, doesn't change. The social cost of carbon, because it's basically the stock valuation of these flow changes in consumption that you get in the welfare numbers, is of course even more sensitive to the discount rate. And there again, you can see that if you increase the discount rate, then yes, the social cost of carbon goes down, but it's still, even at high discount rates, rates of time preference, I should say, it's still multiple orders of magnitude above what current estimates tell you. And of course, if you're a much more patient person, or if you think that Nick Stern was right in saying that we should use a really low discount rate of time preference, then you can get social costs of carbon that are above $3,000. Okay. Final C and D show you a sensitivity with respect to the warming scenario. And so actually, in 2024, we've already broken so far the 1.5 mark set forth in the Paris Agreement. So we're kind of basically already there. But you can ask what would happen if the warming scenario is a bit more optimistic or a bit more pessimistic than the baseline 3 degree above pre-industrial that we've used. Okay, so of course, if we warm less, then the welfare cost is lower, but it's still large. And of course, if we warm more than that, then you can get in a region where the welfare costs are actually really substantial and exceed 60%. Social cost of carbon in 2024 is actually doesn't depend on that particular warming scenario, because it depends on the temperature path implied by a one-time carbon pulse. Okay. And panel E and F, finally, so that's the social cost of carbon, relative to a baseline without any climate change. So if you feed in climate change in the social cost of carbon calculation, it could change things a little bit. So in our current calculation, it's independent. Finally, panel E and F show you welfare and the social cost of carbon as a function of climate sensitivity. And again, because we haven't, connected an emissions block, emissions and a climate change block to our economic block in our welfare counterfactual, there's just simply doesn't depend on the climate sensitivity in our specification welfare, but the social cost of carbon actually is very sensitive to the climate sensitivity. And here, just to emphasize that we've used a fairly conservative one, which is half of the baseline climate sensitivity in Simon's work. That's our $1,000 per ton number. If you use the median one, you get something closer to $1,700 per ton for the social cost of carbon. And if you're more pessimist, then you think that the climate sensitivity is even higher than the median one in leading climate models, you'll get, again, something above $3,000 per ton. Okay, so this is not a very optimistic a set of results for the world going forward, but there's perhaps one silver line, which is these policy implications that I've mentioned at the beginning. And so let me conclude with that. So if you look at what's in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, most decarbonization policies cost about $80 per ton. Okay. Now, if you use a local temperature-based social cost of carbon, that's, let's say, $200 per ton based on local temperature. That's above the cost of decarbonization. So we should start decarbonizing according to that cost-benefit trade-off only if we all internalize damages caused by carbon to the entire world as captured by the social cost of carbon. So if we're all altruistic, we should decarbonize. However, if you think that some countries or a block of countries act at least partially in their own self-interest, you get a different conclusion. Say if you're the United States and you only act in your domestic interest using a domestic cost of carbon, then that's only 45 degrees per ton because the US is a fifth of world economic activity. Again, all based on local temperature. In that case, unilateral decarbonization policy is not cost effective. However, if we use our estimates based on global temperature, then that raises the social cost of carbon for the world, but it also raises the domestic cost of carbon for most countries in the world. And so even only for the US, the domestic cost of carbon is now $200 per ton if you base your analysis on global temperature shock. And for the EU, it would be somewhere between $100 and $150 per ton. And so that's actually way larger than the cost of decarbonization. And so it tells you that even from a domestic perspective, unilateral decarbonization policy is cost effective. Okay, and so that may make decarbonization more likely and more sustainable going forward. And I'm out of time, and so let me just stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Adrien. Well, this is another demonstration that economics is a dismal science. So, Simon, are we doomed?
Obviously, I don't know, but let me share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Simon Dietz. I was very pleased to accept this invitation to discuss Adrien and Diego's paper, not least because from the minute it was published, my inbox started to gradually fill with people asking me, hey, have you seen this paper? What do you think about it? So this was the kick I needed to actually to read it properly. So my discussion is going to comprise 4 little sections. So I'll just very briefly summarize the paper for you and describe what I think the contribution is. That's pretty obvious to you by now. Secondly, I'm going to just raise some questions about the empirical strategy and the empirical results. I by no means do I think I have some kind of smoking gun here, but I think there are some issues that deserve to have a closer look, and I'm going to try and help you see some of those. Thirdly, I'd like to put this social cost of carbon estimate of over $1,000 a ton into context of the previous literature using a recent meta-analysis that I worked on with colleagues. And then lastly, I'd like to just expand upon this issue of how do we interpret huge social cost of carbon estimates. Adrien was talking about that at the end of his presentation. I'm just going to expand upon that a little bit. So in terms of summarizing the paper, so this paper studies the economic effects of global temperature fluctuations, not local, i.e. national or subnational temperature fluctuations. And it does that using time series methods. it finds a large response of GDP to global temperature fluctuations, and that response is statistically significant on a window of about 3 to 8 years after the shock, as I understand it. It finds a much smaller, if more precisely estimated, response to local temperature fluctuations. So in other words, it is this switch from using local temperature as the independent variable to using global temperature as the independent variable, which seems to matter here, not other aspects of the econometric model. And the proposed explanation for why global temperatures have a much bigger effect on GDP than local temperatures is that global temperature shocks have these persistent effects on measures of local extreme weather, and they better predict local extreme weather than local temperatures. Okay. And then they're going to take the empirical estimates and they put it into a simple macro model to estimate the social cost of carbon and welfare effects, and they get this huge social cost of carbon of over $1,000. I think it was 1,056 in the version of the paper I read, and I think it's now 1,065. Okay. So contribution, reasons why you should care about this paper. So firstly, looking at global instead of local temperature shocks is important a priori. So even if the paper hadn't estimated such an enormous difference between global and local effects, this would have been a well worth doing. Secondly, the time series methods that Adrien and Diego use plausibly deal with serial correlation issues that have affected, I think, some previous studies. Thirdly, it's not just an empirical paper or an IAM paper, it's both. And fourthly, the estimates are huge, which is clearly a reason for reading the paper. And lastly, I want to say, and I mean this genuinely, the paper is a pleasure to read. It's very clear and pedagogical. It takes you step by step through the thinking, through all the econometric issues you might encounter working in this area. So it's really good to read. Okay, so now let me move on from the summary and the contribution to a few comments about the empirical strategy and the results. So I'm going to highlight 3 issues. The first one is very straightforward, so I'm just going to say it in the slide. The second 2 issues I'm going to develop in the following few slides. So the first one is that if you want to work with global temperatures, you've got relatively few observations, right? And so you are going to have wide confidence intervals around your estimates, and that is a feature of the paper. And also, if you've got global temperatures, then you can't normally rely on time-fixed effects. That does make it more challenging to control for time-varying confounding factors. Adrien and Diego do a lot to deal with this, but I think there is, in a general sense, a lot of responsibility being placed on these control variables to deal with things like the confounding effects of recessions. Okay. So that's the first issue. The second issue I want to talk about is this mechanism, this idea that global temperature drives local extremes and is a better predictor of those than local temperatures. And the third point I want to make is this sort of recurring issue with climate econometrics. It's this issue of the potential difference between weather and climate impacts. Okay, so let me talk about the mechanism first. So on the left-hand side, you can see figure 9 from the paper. Adrien showed you this. I'm just reproducing it here. So the basic idea here is that top left, the response of local temperatures to a global and local temperature shock looks statistically indistinguishable, and that's reassuring. But the responses of the other weather variables here, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and extreme wind, to a global shock look very different to a local shock. And the basic idea here is that these other local extreme weather variables are not strongly correlated with local temperature, and they're driven by things like the global circulation, which is determined by global temperature. Okay, and I really just want to know more about this mechanism because it's an important part of the paper. I buy this for precipitation and wind because they're obviously related to precip. precipitation, sorry, but looking at the top right, I didn't know whether I was reassured or worried about the result that local extreme heat responds more to global temperature than local temperature, because local temperature and local extreme heat, to my mind, should be quite closely related. So I didn't know what to make of that result, whether I found that meaningful or concerning. In this context, of course, if the basic thesis here is that it is local extremes that affect GDP, then we could regress local GDP on local weather extremes in a panel. And that would provide an alternative way of getting at this same hypothesis, perhaps with more credible identification. Now, there are a couple of papers in the literature that do this. So Max Kotz, Anders Levermann, and Leonie Wentz have published a couple of papers in Nature where they essentially saturate the right-hand side of their regression equation with lots of different climate variables, including higher moments of the temperature and precipitation distribution and so on. And in one way, they generate results which are similar to what Adrien and Diego are finding, because in their paper, they find that adding these additional local climate variables, which are more indicative of extreme weather, adding them matters, right? So both of these papers are saying that more than just local annual average temperature matters. So that's good. But I think there is a non-trivial difference in the actual size of the effects in these papers. So my understanding of the Kotz, Levermann, and Wentz papers is that adding these additional explanatory variables increases the damage estimates by about a factor of 2. Whereas in Adrien Diego's paper, the difference between the global and the local temperature shocks is about a factor of 7, if I understand it. So this is although these effects are of the same sign, the size is very different. And so I think we need to know more. If this is the mechanism, then I think we need to know more about this. Okay, so the third empirical issue I want to talk about is this old chestnut of weather versus climate. So first, just to clarify, what does it mean to say that a 1 degree centigrade increase in global temperature leads to a 12% decline in world GDP? Well, as Adrien very clearly and pedagogically explained at the beginning of his presentation, this is estimated off deviations from the long-run temperature trend. Since temperature is trending upwards and GDP is also trending upwards, you can't just regress the latter on the former. You have to detrend the temperature series, essentially. So your source of identifying variation becomes the deviations, okay? Now, the thing is, looking at the historical series, and this is figure, I think, 3, from the paper, the size of shocks we're looking at here are about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees. So I think it's just important for participants this afternoon to understand that a 1 degree C deviation from the long run trend is about 3 to 4 times larger than the maximum shock we've ever observed, okay? So we're extrapolating in that way. But what we're also doing when we are taking the estimates recovered from this and putting it into the social cost of carbon model is we are treating the responses to deviations from the temperature trend as being the same as changes in long-run average temperature. So this is this weather versus climate issue. But these responses may not be the same because of, for example, the ability to form expectations about long-run climate change, and also in the long run, having more margins to adapt to climate change, like, for example, innovation of adaptation technologies or factor reallocation, okay? Now, one response to my concern is that the temperature effects in Adrien and Diego's paper are persistent, okay? So a temperature shock does actually seem to elevate temperatures for many years thereafter. But I still think this is an issue worth highlighting. And I did wonder in this context whether a more direct application of the empirical model would be using the output from climate models that actually project not only the trend increase in temperature, but actually the volatility around the trend. So what you can see on the left-hand side, it's a chart from the IPCC sixth assessment report. This is these temperature projections come from a series of Earth system models as part of the CMIP6 ensemble. They're projecting not just a smooth increase in annual average temperature, they're actually projecting variability as well. And I think you could directly run these projections through the empirical model, and it would be interesting to see whether they give you the same results. It would be a more direct application of the empirical model. It would not require this assumption that the long run response is identical to the response to the shock. Okay, so now on to the third point, which is how big a social cost of carbon is $1,000 a ton. So for this, I'm able to leverage on some recent work I've done with co-authors where we did a meta-analysis of the literature on the social cost of carbon combined with an expert survey. It's a paper that has recently been published in both the NBER and CEPR working paper series. So what do we do in this paper? We conducted a meta-analysis of the literature based on 1,823 estimates of the social cost of carbon from 147 studies published between 2000 and 2020. We also ran an expert survey of the authors of these same studies, asking firstly for the author's perception of the social cost of carbon distribution in the literature. Secondly, their best estimate of the, quote, true, unquote, social cost of carbon distribution. And thirdly, their opinions on different model structures that have been used in the literature. And the third thing we do in this paper is we combine these two lines of evidence to generate what we're calling a synthetic social cost of carbon distribution that essentially reweights the distribution in the literature according to expert opinions on which model structures improve the estimates, and expert opinions also on what the discounting parameters should be. So what I'm showing you here is just the results from the literature review. So over these many studies, the median social cost of carbon is $39 a ton. The mean is $132 a ton after truncating one or two crazy outliers. And so now I can be quite concrete about where Adrien Diego's estimate sits relative to the literature. It's larger than all but 2% of all estimates. So it's on about the 98th percentile. But interestingly, if I just look at the subset of studies which have some kind of persistence in the damage process, it's on about the 86th percentile. So you can see that many of the studies that have contributed to the largest social costs of carbon in the literature have been studies with persistent damages, either through persistent temperature effects or through persistent effects of temperature shocks on GDP. As far as the expert survey is concerned, we found that more than 4/5 of experts believe that the true social cost of carbon is higher than the social cost of carbon in the literature. That is to say, they think the literature is biased downwards, okay? The expert's best estimate of the literature social cost of carbon is $60 a ton. That's actually closer to the median than the mean in the literature, suggesting that experts are underweighting the role of outliers in the mean. But experts' best estimate of the true social cost of carbon is $142 a ton of CO2. Okay, that's just their stated best estimate of the social cost of carbon. Okay. We also asked experts about their opinions on various structural changes to integrated assessment models which produce the social cost of carbon, and then we took the literature distribution and reweighted it according to these expert opinions. And this gives us our synthetic social cost of carbon distribution. It has a median of $185. It has a mean of $283 after truncating outliers. and that puts Adrien and Diego's estimate on about the 97th percentile. So with this, I'm just being very precise about where this estimate sits relative to the previous literature, which is for sure deep in the right tail of estimates, but there have been some previous estimates that have run into thousands of dollars, and particularly they have come out of models with persistent damages. So let me wrap up my discussion with an issue of how to interpret these numbers. So there used to be a consensus that the social cost of carbon was about $50 a ton. I mean, I'm not aiming to be very exact here, but roughly $50, let's say. Now we're seeing a steady stream of large social cost of carbon estimates, and I'm just going to define large as more than $100, and even huge estimates, and I'm just going to define huge as more than $1,000 a ton. Obviously, if we took values of hundreds of dollars a ton, and particularly thousands of dollars a ton, and we applied that to cost-benefit analysis of government policies, we would pass a whole series of very dramatic climate policies. Okay. But to me, this raises an issue which I'm going to describe as the MAC-SCC paradox. What is this? Well, according to the IPCC 6th assessment report, the MAC, the marginal abatement cost, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot is about $110 a ton in 2030, with only 2 outliers beyond $1,000 a ton. What this means is that the shadow price of an extremely ambitious temperature constraint is an order of magnitude lower than the social cost of carbon that Adrien and Diego are estimating. So there's hence a large difference between huge estimates of the social cost of carbon and most estimates of what it would cost at the margin to attain an extremely ambitious temperature goal. So how do we resolve this paradox? How should we understand this? Well, there are a couple of things to bear in mind first. So the first one is that most contemporary estimates of the social cost of carbon are computed on arbitrary emissions paths. So it's important to understand that these are not the social cost of carbon on an optimal emissions path. And this may make some difference, though probably not a large difference. The second thing to bear in mind is that most estimates of the marginal abatement cost are computed assuming efficient implementation of climate policy, both intertemporally and intratemporally. With these things in mind, I think there are 3 possible inferences we can make about this paradox. So the first one, which Adrien and Diego major on, is the idea that ambitious climate goals pass a cost-benefit test even when climate policy is very inefficient or non-cooperative. Okay. Another possible inference is that if climate policy were efficient, then welfare maximizing climate policy would urgently seek to restore the climate to its pre-industrial state. Right? We would reduce emissions so aggressively if we could implement climate policy efficiently that we would want to avoid far more than 1.5 degrees of warming. We'd want to get back to 0. The third possible inference relates to the nature of fast transitions and what you actually need to take into account if you want to contemplate a fast transition. The third possible inference is that current climate goals are in fact welfare maximizing once we take into account the frictions and adjustment costs that we have to pay to reduce emissions very quickly. And these are not usually accounted for in models of marginal abatement costs. So that is my discussion. Thank you very much. And let's kick it over to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. Very professional as usual. Maybe Adrien, Diego, you want to reply to Simon. And maybe Diego, I saw that you already answered to some of the questions in the Q&A. Maybe you want to expand on those questions, and then I will leave 2 or 3 minutes for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So Adrien, Diego.
That sounds great. Yeah. First of all, thanks so much to Simon for a very thoughtful and interesting discussion. And I think it was also really great to just put these estimates into perspective. Let me maybe start with one point that also came up in the Q&A, and I think it's an important one, and that's the one about extrapolation, because as Simon correctly pointed out, the temperature shocks at the global level that we observe, they're smaller than, the temperature changes that we expect in the next 50, 100 years going forward. So there is some extrapolation that obviously goes into our analysis. But one thing to bear in mind is, the 1 degree Celsius in our that we look at in our local projection specification, that's a normalization, and it's just to make these responses more easily interpretable. Then what we do with these estimates is actually in our model, we look at the similarly small temperature shock. So we consider a small shock as we have them in the data, and then also in the model to estimate these damage functions to these temperature shocks that we observe. Then obviously the extrapolation that we do is, okay, these temperature shocks and the associated damage functions that we estimate, they're representative for climate change more broadly. And that may not be true one-to-one, but we have to somehow discipline these damage functions. And we think that this is very, very valuable variation that we exploit here. And also, maybe it's not that crazy, because also how we model climate change in the model is sort of a sequence of small shocks, right? Because it's not that like climate change happens overnight and suddenly we have warmed by 2 degrees Celsius. It's like every year there is a bit of warming, and so in some sense, we do think actually that this is informative. But obviously there is some extrapolation that goes into this, and we want to be transparent about that. So that's a great point, but we do have to somehow discipline these damage functions. And your idea that you mentioned, I think it's a very interesting one to maybe expand on the climate model in our framework. But there it was also not entirely clear to me, because obviously then you can distinguish between sort of more transitory and persistent temperature changes, but you still have to discipline, okay, what are the economic damages of the persistence versus the transitory ones? And obviously that's our assumption that they are basically similar. I'm not sure how you would basically discriminate between them given the evidence we have in the data.
Diego, just to give me a second to interrupt you. If anyone in the audience wants to raise a question, please raise your hand. So that will allow me to see how much time is required for the Q&A. Thank you so much. So I give you back the floor, Diego. You have anything to say?
Yeah, I just wanted also to say to the audience, thanks for joining, and please raise your hands if you have any questions. Okay. We'd be very happy to answer any further questions. Yeah, so that was the point on extrapolation. And then on the mechanism, I think that's also something that we're also working on. So we're also exploring potential alternative mechanisms like economic spillovers. But the analysis that we have done is really that it's more of a story of this geoscientific explanation that these global shocks, they predict all these local outcomes. And if I also can relate to the Känzig et al. Paper that also Simon mentioned, and it also come up in the chat, I think it's a fantastic paper. The approach is very different, right? Because it's more bottom up. So you kind of have to specify what are the relevant local outcomes, and then you aggregate all these local impacts. Our approach is more top down. So we will capture all the local impacts that will be predicted by these global temperature shocks. And we do think that's an advantage. Plus, we also capture any potential GE, general equilibrium adjustments that may be missed by the local approach, right? Because you sort of net these out with your fixed effects. So that could explain some of these differential impacts. But still, I think it's reassuring to see that sort of two papers with like a similar idea underlying the analysis, but very different approaches still point towards larger damages. So I think that's what I would take away from this.
Okay, so we have two questions from the audience. Let me go and take them in sequence. So Gabriela Mundaka, and then Frank van Mans. Gabriela? Gabriela, you can raise your question. The mic is on. I don't hear anything. So maybe Frank. Frank, are you with us?
Do you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
We hear you.
So I had a question regarding a cross-sectional variation. So I know it's very hard because many things in the cross-sections are happening, but I'm thinking like, yeah, look, in France, you can compare the north of the France with the south of the France of France, and you'll have a 1 degree difference at least. And that is also, I would say, useful variation, although much harder to exploit because other things are going on. Do you see a way of integrating that information and somehow, yeah, making a trade,
okay,
like, yeah, a balance between both? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Let me go back to Gabriela. Gabriela, I think I heard you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay, fine,
Yes.
go ahead.
No, I was wondering, two questions here. Is that I thought that maybe the analysis is a little bit too aggregated, and I don't know whether you are going to move forward to do some spatial econometrics, so take advantage of all this detailed data, right? And the other thing is for policy making. So how do you advise the governments when you just talk about aggregate GDPs? Whether you just take the main sector in countries, say. So in some countries, agriculture is very important. In other countries, it's textile or etc. Right? So because it studied the GDP, how do you design a policy?
Thank you, Gabriela.
Yes.
So let me take a last question, and then I will give the floor back to...
I think I didn't get the first question of Gabriela. Sorry. I think so what was the first one?
Yeah, the first one is that, you know, I'm a little bit worried about your aggregate econometric analysis. It becomes serious.
I see, okay.
You know, so why do you do that? So instead of doing a spatial econometric analysis, that will, and then of course, well, this is another issue on the global thing, but just these two.
Thank you, Gabriela. One last question from Peter Howard. Peter, the mic is on.
Yeah, I had one question, which is sort of actually towards Simon's question discussion as well, which is, you know, in the local temperature estimation models, we're very clear what's being omitted. We're actually capturing a very narrow impacts, you know, group. And I think your paper is doing a good job. But then this raises a question of what are we still missing on these shocks? And I guess that raises the question of, well, we're clearly omitting non-market impacts and tipping points. And so then that raises a separate question I also want to raise, which is then does that raise concerns, the magnitude of these impacts, that these omitted impacts could be even larger, for instance, in non-market impacts where you can adapt and we know there's more limited adaptation. So this kind of then raises like a compounding concern for me.
Thank you, Peter. So Adrien, Diego?
Excellent. Yeah. Why don't I start with Peter's question? So I'm gonna go back. So I think these are excellent points. One exercise that we're doing on basically what we're exactly missing with the local one is also, as Simon suggested, so we can directly estimate the impacts of these extreme events on GDP. And actually, if we do that, we find pretty substantial impacts, and then we can sort of multiply this by the increase in the frequency that we estimate, and then we actually get quite some way to our aggregate estimate, and this can sort of or suggest that like the mechanism that we emphasize is an important one. That's the challenge with the time series analysis, right? That we estimate an aggregate impact, but then we have to shed light on the mechanism, and that's something that we try to flesh out even a bit more clearly in the paper. On the second point, I think tipping points and nonlinearities, that's very relevant. Something we would like to do more, but I'm afraid like in the data we have in our sample, the temperature shocks were relatively small. So I'm not sure to what extent we can speak to nonlinearities in that sample, but you're exactly right. If they are present in the future, that would lead to even bigger impacts. Then obviously adaptation may go the other way around. And there was a comment also on adaptation in the chat. Our estimates incorporate the historical degree of adaptation, which arguably has not been that large. Could be larger in the future, but again, it's difficult to discipline. And this gives me a nice bridge to one of Gabriela's comments, Frank's comment, which was about how we can exploit the cross-section. So I do think the cross-section is difficult to exploit to estimate the climate damages. An older literature has tried that, but it was plagued by identification concerns, which is exactly why this panel literature emerged. But it could be useful to basically shed light on adaptation. So if you look at basically two places that are exposed to some temperature shocks, but one is located in a hotter climate than in another, maybe that could be informative of adaptation. So that's something we wanna look into more. And let me finish with Gabriela's comments. I think very sympathetic. So to the first comment, so obviously here we estimate the global impacts at the global level, and our model is also a model of the world. But it's definitely true that these impacts are heterogeneous and will be felt differently across different regions and places, even though we did some regional analysis in our paper, and we do find substantial heterogeneity, but it's smaller than what the previous literature exploring the panel variation typically finds, because there it was all about the heterogeneity, and the average effects are small. We find big average effects and some heterogeneity, but it's not as stark. And for policy implications, we haven't looked yet into the impacts on different sectors. Given the size of our estimates, I think can't be only agriculture, right? Because agriculture is maybe a couple of % of world GDP, but it would be interesting to look at the impacts on different sectors too. So thanks so much for all the questions.
Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Adrien. Thank you to Simon for your contribution to this successful webinar. Let me guess that this is not the last time you are hearing about this paper. So good luck for the publication, and good luck for presenting this paper to other places. Obviously, it's an important paper, and so good luck. So bye-bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.